Chevre, a freiliche Chanukah, happy Chanukah. Good Yontif, I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begashmis und beruchnis. I hope everyone is healthy, strong, and happy physically and spiritually. As usual in the past couple of weeks, our hearts and minds are with our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, and the war is raging as we speak, and therefore, I forgot to bring a coin, but I'm going to have in mind right now that I'm giving a coin for tzedakah, and I will in Mitzvah right after the shir give a coin for tzedakah. Now we're going to say a prayer as usually. I'm connected to Torah, and this is a video of the thought for the week. So today we said Hallel in honor of Chanukah, and one of the psukim that we said during davening brought to mind immediately the situation right now in Eretz Yisrael. And that pasuk is Vayeishev akeres habayis emabonim smecha. Hallelujah. So this means he returns the barren one to her home. He transforms her into a mother of children, and she is joyful. Praise Hashem. So number one, literally, Hashem Yirachim. There are some mothers that feel themselves barren because they're separated, Rahman al-San, from the children who are being held hostage. So when Mamish asking the Eibishter, bring them home. Vayeishev akeres habayis emabonim smecha. Hallelujah. They should be brought home, the children should be brought home, and then the mother won't feel barren and empty, and then she'll be able to be joyous. Every single second that she's separated from her child, she's in a state of acute anxiety, pressure, sadness, and we beg from the Eibishter, please end it right now. Amen. Ken Yiratzen. It also refers to Chassidus, talks about the mother is the intellect, the children is the emotions, and also you could say in general, the mother represents effort, investment, and the children represents the fruits of your labor. So this is also a request. Vayeishev akeres habayis. This is one of my things that I always tell my students, and I must confess, also concerning myself. Sometimes I don't feel that the return is commensurate with the investment. So I tell my students usually, when it comes to Gashmis, you should have minimum investment and maximum return, because hopefully you can invest and involve yourself majority of your time in things of higher calling. Amen. So therefore, when it comes to the physical, you should have minimum investment and maximum return. In a small amount of time, you should be able to accomplish what you want. When it comes to spiritual things, I say you should have maximum investment and maximum return. Amen. Ken Yiratzen. So that's also what you can have in mind in this prayer, that Vayeishev akeres habayis, that you shouldn't feel that some of your work, some of your investment is left barren, it doesn't see fruits. And the same thing is true concerning intellect, that your emotions, the children, should be led according to the guidance of the intellect. That's what it means. Okay, now, this week's Parsha is Parsha Vayeishev. Obviously, what is the connection between Vayeishev and Chanukah? And what is the relevance in general to our times, and specifically to the situation now in Eretz Yisrael? So, there's a couple of general points that we have to speak about before we speak about Vayeishev. And every single one of these themes is something that could warrant a standalone shir by itself. So one point that starts in Vayeishev is a new paradigm. We have Avram, we mentioned this before slightly. Avram is told to go away from his parents. They were a negative influence. And he had to get away from them, like have a geilul l'makom Torah. His house was a corrupt house. His upbringing was corrupt. And he had to sever ties with that sort of upbringing. That's Avram's story. Yitzchak's story is a new paradigm, which is that he has to stay in-house. He doesn't have to be the one that has to break ground and be a pioneer. He has to represent consolidation, solidifying, and in-house. And Yitzchak was never meant to leave Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Then we have Yaakov, as we mentioned. That's another paradigm. He has to run away from his parents' home, even though his parents' home is the ultimate haven and sanctuary. He has gewaltige parents, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin, Yitzchak and Rivka. But he has to run away, And this is the paradigm of somebody being in an alien environment and nevertheless triumphing over it and being able to raise a Hasidic mishpacha. Yaakov raises his 11 shvatim all in the house of Lavan. Now we come to a new paradigm. And that is, not only does someone have to sometimes find themselves in a situation which is alien, but still amongst relatives. Lavan is Yaakov's father-in-law and his uncle. What about someone who's going to be a prisoner? And we're going to see the idea how a Yid could go from becoming a prisoner to a prince, to royalty. He becomes the viceroy of Egypt, the Mitzvah Shem in next week's Pasha. But how does he deal with being in exile, in the worst conditions of exile? Worse than Yaakov ever had to face, being a prisoner, and before that, a slave. So first he's a slave by Potiphar, he's sold as a slave, and then he becomes a prisoner. And he's the person who's completely innocent. Completely innocent. And none of this should be happening to himself. And still we have to derive strength and learn from this how to overcome adversity in a new paradigm. And that's what we're going to learn in Parashat Vayeishev. Okay, that's only one idea. Now there's going to be another idea, which is a beautiful theme of Parashat Vayeishev. And that's what we're going to discuss primarily today. And that's the idea of chinuch. There is one way to look at it, that Yaakov favored Yosef, and that was the source of all the problems. And from here, parents learn how not to favor one child over the other. Fine. That's one level. That's one interpretation according to Nigla. But there's a much deeper, more beautiful idea. And that is, today we call it the theory of attachment. Or it's called the attachment theory. And that is Yosef's bond with Yaakov. The lesson of chinuch, which is another connection to Chanukah. Chanukah miloshen chinuch. And that is that it's Yosef having been inculcated and educated on a deeper, more intimate level than the rest of his brothers, actually. So therefore, he was protected, he was weaponized, he was armed spiritually to be able to handle everything that was going to come his way and emerge victorious. And therefore, it goes hand in hand why Yaakov actually favored Yosef in a certain sense, because Yaakov was aware of Yosef's destiny and how Yosef needed the extra special fluid, oil, energy, call it whatever you want. And therefore, he gave it to him, and that's what gave him the power to overcome. And we see that point in a couple of areas, as we'll speak about today. And last but not least, there's another amazing idea in Vayeishev, and the Ramban elaborates on it. And this is what I say many times. There's two stories in Tanakh where we see the concept of Hashgacha Pratis, in my humble opinion, more than anywhere else. One is the story of Purim, as we see how every single detail has to follow one from the other, and that constitutes the miracle. Here he kills Vashti because of Haman, then he kills Haman because of Esther. Mordechai heard the plot to kill him, Achashverosh, etc., as we see every single detail when we learn the Megillah. Now here too, the Ramban brings out every single aspect of the story over here, of Yosef, leaving his father's house, his father sending him on a mission, etc., as we'll soon see one of the points over here. He meets Gabriel, an angel, tells him, go right there, straight into the trap, so to speak. Then he gets sold to the Midianites, then to the Ishmaelim. And then he lands in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar wants to seduce him. And then he goes to a prison, which is a prison made for royal prisoners. And they have a problem, and he interprets it. And Pari has a dream. And so on and so forth. And Ramban points it out that if we take away one detail in this chronological order, the whole story falls apart. And then when you think about that this is the beginning of the story of Matan Torah, it starts from when Yosef walks out the door that morning. It's going to land him into Egypt finally, which is going to cause his entire family, the nation of Am Yisrael, to go to Egypt. And then starts the slavery of Egypt, the Golus Mitzrayim, Yetzias Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, etc. It all starts from that very morning that Yosef walks out that door. So the Hashgacha Pratis, which is also a very important thing always to think about, and so too now, The fact what happened, the events happened on Simchas Torah, which is supposed to be the most joyous day. There has to be a lesson in that, and so on and so forth. And in general, the person who lives with Hashgacha Pratis, his whole life becomes uplifted that he doesn't worry so much. We already spoke so long, just giving the introductory major themes of this week's Parsha, which is very important. Okay, so let's now speak about something straight away, the connection between the Parsha and Chanukah. This I spoke about already once before, 3 years ago in 5781 in Parshas Vayeishev. I mentioned this point, but I love it, and I think it's so profound. And since the point of these shurim to talk about how Chassidus changes the look of everything, so we'll start with that. That's the connection between Chanukah and Vayeishev. And that is that when the Parsha says that Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, and then she blames him, and then he's thrown into prison, and he's a total innocent person. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, when it talks about the prison, it says he threw him. Pasuk Chaf says, "Vayikach Adonai Yosef oisai v'yitneu beis hasoyar, mekoyim asher asuri hamelech asurim, vayisham bebeis hasoyar." They threw him into the prison. So Beis HaSoyar is the prison. Now what does the word Beis HaSoyar mean? Why does it mean a prison? So all the Mefarshim talk about it, and many of them point out that the word Soyar is really an Egyptian word. And that's why the pasuk has to say, Mekoyim asher asuri hamelech asurim, to tell you what the word means. The Radak talks about it, but the Ramban says, Amoyre de kevot. So some people say that the word Soyar is connected to Siara, which is the word for moon in Egyptian. So why is the prison called a moon? Because the shape of the roof had like the crescent shape of the moon, so therefore it's called Soyar. But the Ramban says something else. And Beremes, you could say what the Ramban says is the most profound lesson. And that is that the word Siara, moon, he also connects the moon, is connected to Tsoyar, which means window, which means light, and Zoyar, he actually says, which means radiance and brightness. And that's because there was a slight opening in the dungeon of where they threw the prisoners. It was a skylight which allowed light to come in from the outside. So listen to this idea. Something which the Rebbe revolutionized Jewish thought. The Rebbe said, we don't call a hospital a Beit Cholim, we call it a Beis Reifim, a house of healing, not a house for sick people. When it came to the Petzuyim, the wounded, there was a name that they gave the Israeli soldiers. The Rebbe said they have to be called the Mitziyonim, the special soldiers. And the same thing's over here. This is a source for this idea. We could have called it a word which means a prison, a jail, a cell. No. What is the name that the Torah calls the prison? A Beis HaSoyar, a house of light. Why? Because it depends on how you want to experience it. If you want to see the Hashgacha Pratis, how the Eibishter is there with you, so you'll see that small sliver of light, and that is the thing which is going to give you the power and the energy and the empowerment to rise over the darkness. See the light in the darkness. And maybe you could say b'derech remes that this also means why the pasuk says Vayisham beveis hasoyar. Once it says already that Vayitneu beis hasoyar, that they put him in the beis hasoyar, why does the pasuk have to add Vayisham beveis hasoyar? He was there. Because the pasuk is telling you, Yesh leima b'derech remes. Vayisham beveis hasoyar. Where was Yosef's mind at? What was he focused on? The light, the good. And that kept him. That enabled him to have the strength to overcome the darkness, because he saw the light which illuminates the darkness. Tremendous lesson. And this idea of Chanukah, the festival of lights, as Chassidus emphasizes, everything that it says about Chanukah, El Pesach Beisei Mibachutz, Misha Tishka Hachamo, when it's dark, to the outside, and all the other explanation of Chassidus talks about the saying of our sages that talks about the idea of the light illuminating darkness. There was a tremendous story that came out just this week about one of the survivors of the massacre of Simchas Torah this year, that someone's mother-in-law had lost her husband. This person who said the story said, my father-in-law was murdered, and some of the family was still hostage, and the homes were burnt. My mother-in-law hadn't gone back to her home, and the person was saying, the son-in-law, I wanted to salvage something. I didn't think she would be able to handle coming back to the home that was completely burnt to the ground, so I wanted to try to salvage something to bring her back from the home. And there's a picture, it went viral. You see a young man with a yarmulke, wearing special gloves, and he's in the debris, the ashes. Mikimi me'ofer dol me'ashpeis yorem evyoim. And he's sifting through the ashes, I kid you not. And he was sifting through it for hours, and he was feeling to himself, he said the story, Hashem, make a miracle. I should be able to retrieve something. And then he found 2 Chanukah menorahs. They were slightly damaged. Maybe you can call it charred a bit. But the form, it wasn't melted. And you see in the picture, I think the way he's picking up one. And he brings out the point that this is Yiddishkeit. From the ashes, we have a menorah. Out of the darkness, we bring light. And he started crying. Amazing. And this is the point of Yiddishkeit, starting from the story of Vayeishev. What's the prison? What's the dungeon? A house of light. Why? Because the truth is, there is light over there. Because you're living with Hashem all the time, connected to a higher being and to deeper meaning. And you see it everywhere. And that's the only way you'll be able to survive. And that's the connection from Parshas Vayeishev to Chanukah. It's always that sliver of light that we hold on to that's able to overcome everything, as the saying goes, Ma'at oir doicha har b'choshech. A bit of light dispels much darkness. Okay, now let's go through the Parsha from the beginning and talk about the connection. Why was Yosef able to see that light? Because he was the son of Yaakov. We mentioned this before, see for yourself. There's a couple of Balaturim in the beginning of the Parsha where the Balaturim emphasizes that Yosef learned from Yosef learned from Yaakov Soides HaTorah, the inner secrets of the Torah, Kabbalah. And that's why he was different than all the other brothers. And it was this sort of Kabbalah and Zohar, Pnimius HaTorah, the thing which illuminates everything, illuminated the treachery and the terrible things that were going around. Could you imagine? He wakes up one morning, his brothers tell him they want to kill him. And that was the only way, because he saw that sliver of light in prison. Whatever his situation was, he saw the positive. Okay, so now let's talk about the bond of Yaakov and Yosef. I know some of the things I'm saying now, each one is standalone, but these are all things that should give us a sense of support and empowerment in the days that we're in right now. I want to connect to Yutas Kislev was this past Sunday, same idea. That of the idea that we go through a descent and then we come to a higher level. And this is also connected to Chanukah. The analogy that was given concerning Yutas Kislev was that the experience of the Alter Rebbe is compared to the Zayas, when he's crushed, then he gives out the greatest oil. And it's explained, what does it mean? We're comparing the Alter Rebbe being in prison as being crushed. And that's the whole point. The crushing stage is an intermediate stage. It's an intermediary stage. Because while the olive is being crushed, we can't eat him as a fruit. He's being crushed. And on the other hand, we can't use it as an oil, because it isn't oil yet. But that's precisely the point. Sometimes you have to go through a process of being crushed, but through that, we come to the Shemen Zayizach. And that's the story of Chanukah, is the story of how we take oil, which sometimes has to come through an experience of pain, but let's hope the pain is only because you're breaking your head to understand the Pasuk Chumash. But there has to be some growing pains. But through that, we come to greater revelations, greater growth, greater advancement, and exponential development. Okay, now, let's start with the beginning of the parasha, Vayeishev Yaakov. Rashi, the first Rashi, right away says something very amazing, that right at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, it speaks about the family of Esav, and the Torah dedicates one chapter talking about Esav. So it seems like they're a formidable tribe. Then the Parsha starts, and Yaakov could be thinking to himself, why? And then in general, the person learning Chumash could think to himself, why do we have to elaborate on the story of Esav right now and all of his tribe? What's the relevance? Who cares? So Rashi says a point that we just had to speak about certain facts about Esav, but that not really was the intention. We're trying to, on the contrary, to bring out a contrast, we have to first talk about how little time we spent talking about Esav and his family, only one chapter. Meanwhile, the success of Parshas, Vayeishev, Miketz, Vayigash, Vayechi, is all going to be about Yaakov and his children. So that's the first point Rashi says. And he gives an analogy from the pearl. In order to get the pearl, you have to stick your hand into the sand. When you pick it up, it comes up with some pebbles, some debris, whatever's over there. So you have to pick up the handful, which contains some pebbles and debris, but then you just shuck the rest of it away, and you look at the pearl and you focus on the pearl. That's what's going to happen now in the Torah. Our main point was the pearl, which is Yaakov and his family. We just had to mention one chapter about Esav that was before. But the second part of Rashi, I'm going to say what the Pshat is, but what I also believe is a message. I'm going to add something to it. Rashi says that a second Pshat, and that is that there was a person, a flax merchant, Pishtoni, Hazeh Nichnasu Gmalov. There was a certain flax merchant whose camels entered a town to Unim Pishton, and it was laden with flax. And he came to a blacksmith, and the blacksmith wondered, where can all this flax be stored? There was a clever fellow that answered him, one spark can go forth from your bellows, which will burn it all up. Kach Yaakov roas kol alufim, haksuvim lamayla, toma va'omar, mi yochel lichbesh es kulon, maksiv lamata, ela tolas Yaakov Yosef. So when you learn the Pshat, simply, Rashi is explaining that the contrast is to show that Yaakov was actually worried right over here. He saw so many of the non-Jews, of the others. He was wondering, how are we going to be able to compete in a world where it's 99% against 1%, so to speak. So he gives this analogy of the flax and the merchant who comes to the blacksmith, and all you need is one spark from the blacksmith. And he brings the pasuk, V'hoya beis Yaakov eish, ubeis Esav lahava, ubeis Esav lakash. The house of Esav is compared to the straw. Nitzutz yeitzim Yosef, one spark shall go forth from Yosef, shemechala, which will annihilate with Seidif Kulam and burn it all up. So the Eibush is telling, the Torah is telling Yaakov right over here, don't worry, we're not measuring it in quantity. The Jewish nation was always the minority, but we were given special powers. One spark, like a bit of light, dispels much darkness. Can you imagine? All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish or banish one iota of light. All the pounds, tons and tons of straw cannot face up to one spark of fire. So that's the analogy we're learning this week. And I think right now we're living through terrible, terrible, difficult times. I don't want to elaborate concerning the UN, concerning the institutions of Yale, Harvard, Penn State, concerning the protests. And this is unbelievable message for this week's Parsha. In the year 2023, Tafshin Pei Daled, somebody could be sitting and worrying. Comes along Rashi right over here and says, relax, I'll give you an analogy. Yes, we discussed Esav last week's Parsha at the end. But don't worry about it. All you need is one spark, one atom connected to the ultimate superpower of Hashem, and there's nothing to worry about. And that's Yosef. So when you learn the Pashut Pshat in the Pasuk, what Rashi is telling us about the continuation of the Pasuk, Eila told us Yaakov Yosef. Yaakov had a worry, so therefore he's told, don't worry. You have the Yosef, and Yosef will take care of everything. But I'm thinking, I hope I'm not wrong, but I didn't see it anywhere, but to me it seems simple. Vayeishev Yaakov also means over here, that settled Yaakov. Vayeishev Yaakov, Vosatam Nichamtoni. What caused him to become Barikt? Vayeishev Yaakov, what caused him to become Barikt? When he realized that he has a son, Yosef, he saw the future. And he invested in Yosef, as we see from all the Psukim. And therefore he knew and he trusted, he believed in the powers that he had invested in Yosef, and that Yosef was the ultimate successor to Yaakov. Like it says, Eish and Loava, and B'meila, there's nothing to worry about. And now we come to another pasuk, which is unbelievable according to Chassidus. And I saw it in the Rebbe in Sefer Sichas Tafshin Beis, I forgot which page, where on the words that, where it says that Yaakov gave Yosef preference, it said he made him Ksonis Pasim. Now what was that Ksonis Pasim? As it's called, a many-colored coat. And in Pashtus HaKsuvim, if you learn on a simple level, so that was the problem. Because of that coat came all the troubles. Because it showed that he favored him. It's in Sefer HaSichas Tafshin Beis, page 203, 204. And that's how most Mepharshim learn, and that's what the Medrash says. And it was a coat of royalty, it was a coat of melik colors, it was a coat, like it says by the Kohanim, l'chavidul l'seforis. And Rashi says a phenomenal thing, that what does it mean, pasim, fine woolen? He brings a Medrash Agoda that says, al shem tzaroisav. The word pasim is a Rosh Tevis that reflects the four troubles that would happen to Yosef, and that is Chanukah lePotifar. The pay stands for Potifar, he would be sold to Potifar, or l'soichlim, to merchants. That's the samach of Pasim. Or l'Yishmaelim, Yud stands for the Yishmaelim, the Yishmaelites, and the Mem stands for Midyanites. So according to the Pashut Pshat, what does it mean over here? That's because Yosef did that, therefore brought about all the problems. All the tzaras happened to him afterwards. It starts from the jealousy, and therefore this happened, that happened, the other thing. The truth is, the Rebbe says, Faket Pshat. It's because he gave him a garment. This garment was like a bulletproof vest. It was his protection to the Pasim, Potifar, Seichim, Ishmaelim, and Midianites. It was the chinuch that Yaakov gave Yosef that gave him the strength to withstand all of his tzaras. So again, we see the point that it was the chinuch, his attachment to Yaakov, that prevented it. Okay, I want to speak more, but I see that it's very, very late. So we'll just end off with another famous, obvious one. And that was when it came to the point where Yosef was being so troubled and so to speak, harassed and hounded by Potiphar's wife. She tried to seduce him every single which way possible, again and again, and he kept on turning her down, until finally, Rashi says, in one case, he almost succumbed to the charms of Potiphar's wife. But what happened, Rashi says, that Lasis Malachte, Rav Shmuel, it's a famous Rashi. See there, but what was the bottom line? What prevented him? When push came to shove, he saw the image of his father there. Everybody who's a Bochen Tim Chitzmimim remembers Farbrengens of Mashpiyim that talk about this idea that if you have the Rebbe in front of you, that will prevent you from everything and that will steer you clear. Similar to having the Eibishter in front of you. But here we have a source. Yosef remembered all the love, all the education, all the personal care and interest and investment that Yaakov invested in him, and he couldn't betray the loyalty, he couldn't betray the education, he couldn't betray the guidance. He knew what his mission was. So here's the Chassidische Bacher, Vayeishev HaTzadik, the innocent, pure Vayeishev HaTzadik, and he's being seduced and put to the test in ways that a lesser man would have succumbed. But it's the chinuch again, the chinuch of Yaakov. Why is the Musti Yukni Shaloviv appearing to him? Because the chinuch was so powerful. And this teaches us again, we see the return. When a person invests on a lake tzachanayin in them, when you invest in the chinuch of your children, of your talmidim, and you give of yourself, it's kost gesund. When you give of yourself to your children, and then they return it in flying colors, they pass the test, and they grow up to bring salvation to everyone, as we see in the story of Vayeishev HaTzadik. There was one more lesson that I wanted to discuss connected to Yosef. We'll have to leave it for another time, but it's also very, very important. Al Kapanim, what do we see from everything we spoke today? Number one, the lesson, we have nothing to fear, as we see from the first Rashi. Vayeishev Yaakov, this is my message to you from the Parsha. Vayeishev, Beryl Shmerel. Vayeishev, Mendy. Vayeishev, relax, take it easy. It's taka terrible, and there's messages coming from Eretz Yisrael. We should give more tzedakah. We should daven. True. But don't get nispol from the numbers. Don't get nispol from the UN, and don't get nispol from Harvard, Yale, and Penn State, and don't get nispol from the hundreds of thousands that are marching and protesting against us. All we need is that one spark. What's that spark? The spark of your neshama. The spark of the fire connecting to its source, and it'll take care of the whole thing, no problem. That's one message. And the other message is in-house. We have to have a strong education of Jewish pride, connected to the Shleimus Ha'aretz. Every Yid has to understand how we're connected to Eretz Yisrael, and we have pride. Every Yid has to understand Sha'oso nisim lavoseinu bayomim ha'em bizman hazeh. When a Yid knows Jewish history, he's not in the spoil. We've been here before. We know what's going to happen. Sha'oso nisim lavoseinu bayomim ha'em bizman hazeh. We only want it to be without pain. We only want it to be without tzaddis. So let it end now. But Vayeishev Shmerel, relax. We're saying the bracha, and the bracha can't be levatola. Sha'osa nisim laviseino. We are going to see miracles by Yomim Me'em Bizman Hazeh. And like the story of Vitas Kislev, the revelation of Chassidus after the crushing was much greater. Jewish identity is becoming much more powerful. We see the arousal of Jews throughout the world, throughout the entire globe, is now in a state of heightened awareness that hasn't been for many, many decades. So that's the message that we take from this week's Parsha, and that's the connection to Vayeishev and Chanukah, and the Eibusher should help. We should have a lichtige Chanukah, Ol Chol B'nei Yisrael Ye'or B'mishveisam. We should see how it banishes any and all forms of darkness, and we should come to the Gula Mitzvah Shleima, take it from Yad Mamish, posting from my home, your man in Melbourne, Be'ez Hashem Yisborich. Good Shabbos.